Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you.
All right, thank you. My name is Nic Boet. I work in the healthcare sector as a network security engineer. This project doesn't really touch on any of that aspects. This is probably more geared towards system administrators or anyone who needs to process syslog events to be sent to an email or a mobile phone or pager address. So my motivation for writing this dates back quite a while. The open source edition of syslog-ng did not have a built-in SMTP driver. A lot of the examples out there would either use a pipe or some type of standard input driver to forward it through a bash script, or in my case, I originally wrote it in Perl. So it was pretty simplified back then, but what I really needed was some type of logic to throttle messages to not get flooded to my phone with 100 messages for some type of power event that kept triggering, or whatever the situation might be for that. So I needed to filter by per host, run on a centralized log collector, so I just have one place to manage it. And I needed to also have some type of way to filter out that noise that's being generated. Ideally, I started with that with doing all that configuration within syslog-ng itself. And for the most part, that's where a lot of the pre-filtering I do exists. But it does allow you to have the flexibility to do it in either spot. So you can really customize where you want to do that. And one of the last kind of things that kind of evolved in this was having to have a mechanism to email different support teams or individuals based on a very specific message that comes through. And I didn't really want to edit the script every time I need to either match a new filter or add another person or kind of change where those messages would get routed to. So this current version is kind of more of a draft sample for me to learn how to use TCL, object-oriented programming a bit. So it's probably not 100% OO spec, but it at least got me to dabble in it a little bit. The kind of how it integrates is you just get the output of syslog-ng in a standard that we can parse easily. I opted to use TCL lists just because it was pretty simple to parse, pretty low overhead. And a lot of the other configuration files also depend on lists as opposed to CSV, which I started using that, but had a bit of problems with trying to do CSV within CSV. So it just didn't parse right. I just went to the lists. And it integrates with some configuration to say, okay, call this program, which is the TclOO script, and that matches off of patterns. So you kind of duplicate some patterns in the config that you would say you want to send to from syslog. So usually I'd say, alerts, criticals, emergencies, and then some miscellaneous ones you'd send there. So you can refine that pattern down a little further in this utility to say, if it's a power event, send it to, a facilities team. If it's a disk event, send it to a SAN team. And it does a lookup to see if it was sent recently, and this pretty much drops the message because it doesn't need to process it forward. We're not storing the messages. The main syslog collector is doing that already for us. So we don't care. We just want to discard it if it's been seen already. So it's a pretty simple config file for the contacts. Again, it's just a list input, and this turned out to have a lot more flexibility than I actually need to have on it. You can either set it up with individual users, or you could have it set to a team or a distribution group. So it kind of depends on how you want to manage that on your site. And it also supports listing a pager or mobile phone. Probably not many people have pagers anymore, but being in healthcare, we still have a number of us that carry them. So, and it's not doing SMS out of the gate from here. It's really looking at a email address. So you have to look up, for Sprint, T-Mobile, Verizon to get the right email structure for that to work. And that just gets imported into a very simple table in memory. And that allows us to do a little more dynamic querying. We can have multiple groups called out for some patterns. So you can have one pattern email, the admin and your pager on call. And it can select between email versus, a pager. So nothing too crazy there. The configuration file for the actual events is also, a list import, and this really defines what type of messages you'd want to get sent out. So there's two examples down here. The one that I usually use by default is just getting a generic system alert or critical status, and where the hash comes into play is the third parameter here. That allows you to kind of bind or map a pattern to what that pattern is to what you actually want to throttle against. So this is what actually gets injected into another SQL table to do the lookup to compare if it was sent recently or not, and then who actually gets that message based off of the group configuration. So you have the on-call or the admin groups defined here again, and you can define it even more granular above to say, okay, we do get alerts for MD admin, but we want to treat those differently. So you can specify that by stating it above. And this becomes the default email subject within Sendmail as well. And the throttle hash is kind of that makes it unique for where you can send it to. So in this sample here, we're looking for BPDU guards, which is a condition on a network side for span and tree. And in this instance here, because our hash incorporates the host from the log message, so you'd have site 1 or site 2 or device 1, device 2, you would actually get two separate messages throttled through here. So you're not going to get messages that are masked because of one system triggered a BPDU guard, and now you silence the whole event out for the rest of your organization. One of the commercial products that we actually were using has that problem in it, and this is part of the motivation too to replace it with this code, so that when we do get a BPDU guard, we're not getting thousands of them masked from another site that has a similar problem. We want to know that, but again, we only want one email and not 1,000. So we'd get two in this instance within wherever the set period you defined within the configuration file back here, and it's based in seconds. So you can say, okay, I only want rate events or BPDU guards once a day or every 10 minutes, instead of going with like a default of an hour. So there's some flexibility in selecting that. The actual patterns and config files for that get imported in and are dynamically created from into a new method within the process. So we actually are compiling the switch statements from the config. So there's a method to import the configuration file, and then there's method to create the new switch statement. And essentially that boils down to, you just have to call the OO statement for the patterns you want to send through, call the method patterns with each line you're reading from standard input into the program. So this got rid of having to tweak the script every time you have to edit it. And yes, I am using PowerPoint TclOO, so it's a little simplified. The code does not compile, right? I saw a couple comments there, but I opted to kind of simplify here. So yeah, there's a couple typos in the presentation for that. It was just a little messy to read in a one-line statement here. So in the Throttle database here pairs the hash, which is that string you created. So the string that we created back here is the variable we extract from the the host name of the message, and then whatever string you call this. And you can call this whatever you want to call it, as long as it's unique and you don't have overlaps and duplicates through here. So it just does a simple query to say, okay, is it in the database, and is it within the time period from what we said we want to throttle it to? So if it's outside of that, we just discard it. But otherwise, we do return true and let the other process continue through to the actions, which would, in this case, we want to email, so it triggers a Sendmail method to notify the groups and looks up the groups and functions from there. There is some flexibility that I haven't quite leveraged yet. I did need to add it in for some other functionality. So instead of having this email, you could do code injection through here by just embedding TclOO statements at the last parameter, and this would allow you to kick off a separate program to run in addition to emailing, or you could exclude the email groups and just have it, kick off another program to run instead of emailing off. And again, it would still throttle it down. So if you only want that to run once event in a period of time, then that is a way you can, scale back and kind of expand the functionality of that code. So for the most part, it works. I do have it run in prod in one of my environments here. The code is posted out there for consumption and pleasure. So there's also a few other packages I had thrown out, not directly related to this project, but I did have to have some TDBC modules for one of my projects on Gen 2 I was working on. So those were not in the official repo. I did post them there if anyone is interested in that as well. So with that, I saw a couple questions.